to this more. Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to start out this morning with Ken Herner describing how you run batch jobs, and in particular how you use the POMS system, which allows you to run large, broad batch jobs across multiple machines. I think one thing to realize about this is that one of the reasons that everything we've been showing you is kind of complex and difficult is that you are running millions of lines. The code base is probably 1 million lines of code. And in principle, in the end, you have access to something like 5,000 computers at once, accessing at this point close to 10 petabytes of data reasonably transparently. So it turns out that that's not easy to do unless you have billions of dollars of money, which we don't have. So we have solutions which allow you to do this, but sometimes they're a little complex. So that's sort of the introduction. But the thing to realize is that once you know how to do this, you actually do have access to very impressive amounts of resources, which is what DUNE is going to need. So I think I'm going to just let Ken take over. Ken, are you ready to go on this? Do you want me to stop sharing and let you share? And do we have a, are you going to have a link, or can you put a link? Do we have a link to the Google Doc where people can ask questions?
Isn't it the same one from yesterday?
Oh, okay, it is
I
the same one
so
from
anyway.
yesterday. Okay, good. So if people don't know, but we should probably put that link into the chat again so that people are certain. There it is. Thanks, Claire. Okay, so that's the main thing. If you have questions, put them in the Google Doc, and for those who weren't here yesterday, the thing you do is there's sort of a template for how you do a question at the top. Copy that down into the correct section at the bottom and then ask your question. And if your question is answered, you can change it to green, I got it. And so I'm actually going to go, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to let Ken loose. Ken, are you feeling loose?
There.
Yes. Okay. There we go.
Not a bit, but that's not your problem.
Okay.
So yes, I think we learned sharing.
Yeah, you might want to make your type a little
I'm going to close.
Larger.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, I'm going to shut up.
I'm going to also close my Slack because that was a bit distracting and I don't need that anymore. Don't save that. Get rid of these other windows we don't need. All right, we have this guy. We don't need him anymore too. We don't need him anymore. Okay. Try to keep things as clear as possible on my end, so I'm not running around back and forth all the time. I lose track of what window I'm in, and hilarity does not ensue.
Ken, I would like to just to know if people can put thumbs up or thumbs down on the Zoom to know if it's too small, the font on the.
The font is almost certainly too small. I just haven't gotten it to.
But once it's okay, please, people on the chat on Zoom, send us feedback on thumbs up if you can.
Let me get in the right directory here. There.
Yeah, perhaps this
somewhat better, I think.
Yeah.
It might even be one more.
Yeah, this looks
great.
Thank you.
That over there. Stupid Zoom controls always get in the worst possible place. Okay. All right, I may sip coffee throughout here just a little bit because I need some. What can I tell you? Okay, so we will begin picking up more or less where we left off yesterday. I've got the link here to yesterday's session where we did introduction to batch submissions, and we also did some very basic, just kind of not a little more than hello world, but not so complicated as something you would do in real life with POMS submissions. But at least we get the feel of it, and how do we upload our user proxy and that sort of thing. So in this session, I've got, I think, 5 examples, so we only get like 9 minutes per, but basically I'm just going to show you the corresponding config and point out some of the overrides on the web page and just explain what each piece is trying to do, right? I will probably skip the boilerplate intro to POMS here and let you read that at your leisure. Just point out, here is the link to the main POMS page. I've got the analysis thing set up here, so if you click that, that will get you back in. And you usually get something like this. Make sure analysis is selected and make sure DUNE is selected, just in case you have done this before with other experiments and or other roles. And once we've done that, let's go back here. All right, so normally, right, what you're going to do when you're running jobs for real is you're going to run over a fairly large data set. I have some example SAM data set that I created here, which is 10-ish files, but in reality, right, you're going to run probably in the thousands. You may have multiple steps to your workflow. You may need to modify some parameters in a Fickle file in such a way that it's different from whatever the default one is in the release. And you may or may not need to bring in custom code, and things can get complicated fairly quickly. So we're going to try to get you most of the way towards what you would do realistically. So let's start with the first example then. So in this one, all we're going to do is modify a Fickle file. So basically, we're going to make a local copy of it and modify it and then use that in our job. Why would we want to do that? So yesterday, right, we did some examples of where we were importing a custom tarball to the worker node environment. And we may or may not have made code modifications in there. But if you aren't modifying the code and you don't have any new libraries, rather than download what probably will end up being multiple packages, building all that, tarring it up, running it through the data transfer mechanisms, if really all you can get away with is copying a local file or copy it out of CVMFS and into your job, just edit it there and you're done, why go through all this extra building and data transferring? And this, I think, is just a much cleaner way to proceed. And it's completely reproducible and everything, so it's not like you have any issues there. All the output of the POMS submissions are saved. So if you click on the first link there, this is campaign stage ID 14.110. Here we go. All right, so my jobs went hell because I didn't give them enough memory initially, but I fixed that. Okay, so what do we see here? We see something fairly similar to what we saw yesterday. It's actually the same input data set. I gave it a slightly different name, the stage name, sorry. And we're using a slightly different config file, which I'll show you momentarily. We have here defined the global tar dir and the global tar name. We're actually not going to use the tar file, but those are still here. I should probably just get rid of those. So they're not needed for this. And a different Fickle file. And for each of these exercises, the assumption is then you would have a separate output directory that's within the DUNE tutorial May 22 directory that you made yesterday in your Scratch area. That was, I think, one of the first things that Mike had you do. All right, so then we just say, okay, our input data set, our SAM data set for the job submission is just going to be data set, which is defined right up here. We've got our same software version we were using yesterday. I set a somewhat high limit on this, just in that this is going to be a fairly small submission, and RICO 2 sometimes can creep up in memory, we have seen in the past. And we talked about IFTHR a little bit yesterday as well. We talked about N files per job. For this test, we're going to leave this to 1. Depending on exactly what you're doing, right? You may want it to be much greater than 1. But for this particular thing, let's pretend we want to keep a 1-to-1 correspondence between input files and output files, which, depending on what you're doing, again, may be highly desirable. But for this, we'll keep that. Remember, we talked about yesterday the job type, the launch setup scripts. Those are exactly the same as we used yesterday as well. All right, so let's switch gears quickly and let's go over, I think I may have the wrong, oh, I do have the wrong config in here. I'll fix that in a second. Okay, so let's quickly look at this. This is POMS demo SAM Fickle edit. So here's what's in this config file. Again, we talked about a lot of this yesterday with the different sections and how the file is structured. Someone, here we're getting an echo or somebody's not muted. Okay, so the difference between what we did before, a couple things. You'll notice here, I commented out the tar file name option because, as we said, we're intentionally doing this because we don't want to make a tar file. So I left the option in just to show you, but it is commented out. The use CVMS Dropbox is not needed anymore. And if you don't have a tar file, well, it doesn't do anything anyway. The rest is as we had before. Now we get into kind of the differences. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to have it source the usual DUNE setup script. I've just done the variable expansion here with the experiment, which is set to DUNE. You could hard code this depending on what you're doing, but and then as far as what UPS products we want it to set up, well, we're going to have it set up DUNE software with our usual version. But the interesting work happens in the prescript sections here. All right. So the first prescript, what have I said? If we don't have in whatever directory we start in, which is just the main directory Condor job starts, you almost never need to switch out of that. So if we don't have a local version of Fickle file where we've defined that elsewhere in the overrides, copy it from DUNE software dir Fickle, make a local copy of it, and see how, again, with the prescripts, you can do the valid bash stuff. I just did a 1-line if statement here, right? So now we've got a local copy of this file. And then if you look at the RICO 2 file, it actually, the default one still uses their full reconstructed data tier, which we ended up not using for RICO 2. So I thought, oh, this is a great example of what we want to do. So then I have another prescript. So these just run in order, prescript 1 to however many you have. I think you can have up to 100. So then we're just going to inject this extra line here. All right, so I'm just going to echo this, append it on the end of Fickle file, which is our local copy, right? And then we're done. Then we run the same executable. We give it some name here. We want the output to be the input file name and then underscore RICO 2, blah, 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 blah. Remember yesterday I mentioned if you want to escape a %, you have to do 2% just because of the way this gets parsed. And we also discussed yesterday about how you have to, in certain parts of this, you have to escape the special characters, in case the dollar signs and the slashes. And again, I don't want to spend time on this right now. I refer you to yesterday's lecture for going over that. Though it's kind of confusing, I'll say it because in the pre and postscripts, you don't need to escape them. So just be aware of that. Now we've also got a postscript in this case, because I wanted to introduce the idea of metadata generation, right? A lot of times we're going to want to be generating output metadata, especially if this is ever going to end up in SAM. So what we're using here is the extractor prod.py script. That's a modified version of extractor dict, which uses the SAM metadata dumper. This is available in the DUNE util package. So I just tell it, well, my in file is going to be, well, I don't know what the full name of it is yet because I don't know what the input file was, but I can run an ls command here, right? And this will pick up my new file. If I wanted to give it some campaign value in the metadata, I can do that. I've defined campaign in the global section, which is, I said, to default to May 2022 tutorial. Fine. Give it the application version, name, and family. And then what that does, that just dumps to the standard out JSON formatted file. And then I just redirect that into whatever this file name was, .json. Now you'll notice this particular formulation will only work if I have one such file. If I have more than one, then I have to be a little more careful. And then finally in the output section, so my output, again, I don't know the full name because I don't know which input file is going to go to which job. So I just put a generic, Rico2 here. Destination is set in the overrides on the web page. I say declare metadata false because this is just a test. I don't want to actually declare this to SAM, but I could if I set this to true. And then the metadata extractor is JSON because I made the JSON file appear. And because I named it such that its output file name exactly .json, POMS will automatically look for such a file and use that to declare the file to SAM. And then allocation is if you are copying, if your destination directory is its permanent location. If you were writing directly to tapeback, for example, you could have it just immediately declare the location too. In this case, we're copying back to scratch, so we're going to leave that to false. So that's that example. What I would encourage you to do is give me about 10 seconds to fix this config file because that is the wrong one. Remember yesterday what we did to clone a campaign. You can clone this one from me, just give it your own output directory names. There we go. And submit that. Okay, now this shows up at the right. Good. And if I wanted, I would come down here. I can do a new submission. And away it goes. Okay, any questions on that? But I guess the thing to emphasize is you might end up in a case where you need to do similar things to multiple Fickle files. We did a similar thing with the run type for in production when we're doing the FAR detector vertical drift Monte Carlo. We basically rather than make whole new Fickle files for the different simulation stages, only differing by what the run type was in the output. We just basically did this trick where we make a local copy of the Fickle, change the run type that goes into the metadata, and then we had a little for loop that was for my file in the gen Fickle file, the jan4, the detsim, the Rico, and just did that same thing for it. So again, you can have many scripts, you could be doing different things. Again, really pretty much any valid bash can go in here. And this could call also another script if you want, or you could source another script as needed. Okay, and there's our submission. If there are other questions, then I know we should probably get a move on here. No questions, right? I don't have the chat up.
There's a question about the JSON file, but I'm answering it.
Yeah, and you don't have to use extractor prod either. There's any number of other ways you can make that JSON file, or you don't even have to do that.
In fact, we're going to need a new different thing on extractor prod once we're no longer running root files.
Yeah, there is another. We have a generic one called Pandora metadata, which you don't have to be running Pandora. That was just the first thing that was wrong. That will take an arbitrary file, and then it will also take an arbitrary. You can read in another JSON file, which has extra metadata fields set if you want, so it doesn't have to read them from the file directly. So that's a good point. Thanks, Steve. All right, so yeah, I've only got 45 minutes, right? So let's go on to the next one. So another thing you may often have to do is, like we said, multiple steps within the same workflow. Kind of two ways to do that. One is you run multiple stages within the same job. The other being you split the stages into different jobs, and we have examples of each. Let's start with running 2 steps in the same job. So in this case, what we're going to do, we're going to run the same Rico2 thing as we did in the first example, and then we're also going to run a Michelle removing step on that output. So again, we're going to keep the input file, 1 file per job, just to preserve the correspondence. And then in there, we're going to run the Michelle removing right after the Rico2. And in this case, we're going to copy them back to different directories just to keep things cleaner. Quick reminder, right, about being careful where you put your outputs and making sure that you aren't putting more than a few thousand files in any one directory in Dcache, which we also discussed yesterday. This is another way people can get into trouble a lot. If you have, multiple output files for every job, and then you have 10,000 jobs, and then you try to all write them back to directory, well, suddenly that gets kind of unworkable. So you may need to do other things like make separate subdirectories for each job, if you have many outputs, or each different type of file goes to a different directory. Several ways to skin the cat, but keep that rule in mind. All right, so here was the link. So this is the campaign itself as opposed to the campaign stages. Of course, there's only one stage here. So we'll click on that. So very, very similar to what we just saw. Different slightly config. Same Rico. We have another Fickle file, obviously, and change the output directory. Everything else pretty much the same. Just threw in one other new wrinkle here, and that is how I'm overwriting the output directory for the second type of file, but there are a second rule about outputs. So let's have a look at this config. Again, going to be very similar to what we just saw. I kept in the redefine the data tier thing, so you'll see that again. Okay, and that's right here. I did the same also with the Michelle. I have another case we're copying the Michelle file locally, and we're just redefining what the output file name is going to be. The default is Michelle removing.root. So again, multiple ways to skin this cat too. We could have left this the same, and then we would have had an output file named Michelle removing.root, and then we could have done a postscript step to rename that file. Or we could have done an extra executable to run the move command. And I say there's all sorts of ways to do it. I have here commented out, but just again to show, here was that other metadata extractor I was talking about. And this will work on a file that doesn't have this artsam stuff in it. All right, so the key difference here, however, is going to be in the executable section, or I should say sections. See how we had the main executable section? We begin with the Rico2 Fickle. We give it some output name, very much like what we had before. And then we have IFDH art is set to true, so we don't specify an input file, right? The script's going to handle the file looping for us. Now, in this particular case, we're only going to have one input file, so fine. But then we have executable 1. Now, this guy, we can have executable 1, executable 2, and so on and so forth. So here we're running the Michelle removing, and we've chained the outputs. That is the input file specified minus S, right? We have arg6. We have a wildcard on here. So we're using the output of Rico2 as the input to the Michelle removing step. Now in this case, we're actually I forced it back to Michelle removing.root. I don't remember why I did that. I probably shouldn't have. I had to think about that. And then we have 2 output sections as well. So the first one is going to be for the Rico2 files, but I can't just say star Rico2 star.root anymore, right? Because I also now have the Michelle removing files that would match that pattern. But I say, I know, however, that the Rico2 outputs all have, they end with a timestamp and then .root. And timestamp is, I made it in UTC, so it's going to be the time, and then it's going to end with Z for Zulu. So if I want only the Rico2s, I can do star, and I know that last character in the timestamp is a Z, and then .root. And the way we named the output file up here in the prescript, right? I told it to do blah, 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 underscore Michelle removing.root. So I can take advantage of that in the second job output. And then its destination is set according to the overrides on the website, as we said. That makes sense?
Can the output for the second stage looks like it's just called Michelle removing.root? Is that you have a wildcard defined for that? Is that a typo, or is that somehow magically going to change Michelle removing.root into?
So I think what I did here is I had this pulled from something else, and then I changed my mind and decided to change it up here in the
okay.
So I should get rid of
just modify that one. Okay. In the example.
So this should actually, I am an Emacs guy, as you see here. So this we should actually kill. And that should be like that. There we go. And then we can submit that. That actually might be why all these failed, come to think of it. They're probably what? I can't copy any outputs like that. All right, so in the interest of time, probably want to move on unless there's any burning questions. No. All right. Let me close some of these. It's getting confusing to me here. All right. So as I mentioned, the other way you can do this would be to do separate stages for your different parts. So depends a little bit on what you're doing as to what the best way to proceed is. So typically what we do when we're running simulation is I have found it better to do everything through Rico, or sometimes if people want the analysis tree step 2, do it all in one job. Because I don't want to pay the overhead of copying all the intermediate outputs around and having to wait for them to finish for the next stage to start, right? We only typically copy back to Rico. So once you've got the slot, I figure to run your work, just use it. The one disadvantage of that, though, is if you're making analysis tuples or shell removing files, and you're only running them based on the input where you have one file where you're doing everything in one job, those shell removing files tend to be very small. So then you got to merge them later because you don't want to be writing, a bunch of 100K files to tape. Another way to do that, however, would be you could do everything up through Rico in one job and then have a second stage which does the analysis tuple creation and then merge. That way you can do a many to one merge effectively. We have another example of that in production, but that's basically the intent with this next one. We're going to run the same steps, but we're going to break into 2 stages. So let's go to this one now. Now here I go to the campaign page, and indeed I see my 2 stages. But if I click on the Rico 2 one, which is where we start, again, different config file, you'll notice I have this dash stage option that I've added. It will see how that comes into play when we look at the config. Again, I should get rid of this tar, dir, and tar name. Ignore that. We don't have tar files. We don't want to use tar files anymore if we don't have to. I've defined both Fickle files in both stages, even though I don't end up actually needing them both, just to kind of make it easy. But now if we scroll down a little bit, we have the same setup and job type. But if we look at the dependencies section, where this was blank before, this is hard to see because the names are long. There we go. We can see how this is graphically represented, that the multi-stage, the Rico 2, is then feeding in the next shell removing stage. And I think the best thing to do is look at the config for that. Then we look at multi-stage. Excuse me. Okay, so same prescript stuff we had before. Now you'll note and say, well, wait, you don't have to actually copy the both Fickle files into both stages and do this, and that is true. I did not change it though, even though I could, as we'll see, just in the interest of getting this all to work quickly. And that's not a very computationally expensive thing. So I didn't worry about it for now. But we look in here, so we have the main executable section, which defaults to be the Rico 2 bit, right? So that's exactly the same thing we have. You'll notice I dropped down, however, to 1 executable and 1 job output section. But I added some stuff down here. You have the stage Rico 2 and the stage Michelle. And these stage names can be anything you want. And what happens here is when you give that -- stage option, as we did here, then it will load the corresponding set of additional overrides that you've made in here. So you can have different ones for the different stages. So for example, in the Rico 2 stage, I've said, okay, the job output test is, and when you set these extra overrides, you have to do section dot value, not just value. It doesn't know which section to go in otherwise. So slightly different from what's earlier in this script or in the config. Okay? So we've used this add to dataset trick, and we've given it this special _POMS _task tag. That is a signal to POMS that says, okay, all of the outputs that get added in the job output section, these are going to be used as an intermediate data set, which is going to feed a subsequent stage. Now, POMS takes care of all of this for you internally as far as making the actual data set and passing that into the next stage. And we'll see how that works in just a second. So that's why that's in there. Now, I didn't add any other stuff, right? Because the defaults that I have set are kind of for the Rico 2. Now I go into the stage Michelle bit, however, and then I've got some extra stuff here. And then I said, okay, the postscript, in this case, instead of running the extractor prod, I'm going to run this Pandora metadata bit. The arg2 up here, but I don't want it to be the Rico 2 file. I want it to be the Michelle Fickle file, fine. And arg3 and 4, I've changed because we use for this, we use the -t, and instead of doing the postscript trick, I'm just telling it to ignore that, and then I'm just giving it some other name here, which is kind of up to you. I didn't worry about getting the input file name into the output file name here because the way I intend to use this is I'm going to have multiple input files getting merged into a single Michelle removing output file. So there's really no reason that we have to have a particular file in the name. Then of course you have to deal with getting the parentage right in the metadata, but there are ways to do that, which I did not include here. And then I've changed the add output because we need to have a different pattern to match. And then the output destination is different too. Okay. So what would ideally happen here in the perfect world is, it's like these failed. So I can look at that. You would launch once the job's finish and the outputs have been properly declared. The next stage would automatically launch. So this is running fine. We'll let that go. All right, so now let's go back here and see what's in the next stage. I don't know if you can just click that. No, you can't. Okay. Oh, you can. So you can actually click down in that dependencies box. If you double click on the stage you want, it'll take you there. So here's the next stage, right, where I've done stage Michelle. Notice the input data set here is not the same anymore. It's this special POMS data set tag. So that is the signal to POMS that, oh, use that intermediate data set created from the outputs of the previous stage as the input data set here. Make sense? And here I've changed n files per job to be 20 instead of 1. Now this number could be whatever it needs to be to create reasonably sized outputs, but I just kind of guessed and said 20 here. I think what's going to happen, this is for this data set size, I'm probably only going to get 1 job in this stage because I think the input data set is for Rico 2 is under 20 files. And as we mentioned yesterday, if you have a limit on your SAM consumer, you want to set that to equal or greater n files per job. So that's basically how that works. Any questions on that way of doing it? And granted, this is a bit simplified, of course, and real life may get slightly more complicated depending on what you're doing, but just you might have 3 or 4 different stages, or you might have multiple stages that depend on one previous stage. You could have multiple parallel stages, and yeah, you can get as complicated as you want. Any other questions on that? Okay, sounds like not. All right, next one is iterating over data sets or lists. So the secret of the concept of a data set in POMS is it doesn't actually have to be a SAM data set. It's really just it's just a string, honestly. You could even have lists if you wanted to iterate over multiple data sets. Or imagine you had some parameter set and you wanted to do a submission iterating over this each time. Maybe you had a series of beam momenta you wanted to generate different Monte Carlo for, or tweak some setting in a Fickle and just iterate over these steps. And you don't want to have to set up separate campaigns for all those. Oh, this is what the list is good for. So if we go to our next link then, bring this over here. Here's the list. So what I've done here, right, these are just strings. I have a small config here. Basically, all I'm doing in this one is we're running a generator. We're just generating some. Where's that? Yeah.
Ken, you think you're showing a window right now because you're not?
Oh, did we lose the share? Uh-oh. Sorry. Better?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. All right, so here's this guy. So back in here, this is basically just very straightforward. This is an even simpler input file, right, for the config. We're just running the generator step. I've included in here, I defined this out name variable, which will include the names that we're iterating over. So Fickle file will be determined by the overrides, and this name will also have part of that Fickle file name in it. And I've got my usual stuff for the outputs. Coming back here, then we didn't see, sorry. So we've got this split type is a list, as you see here. And then you have the split data, which are just these strings, right? But the way we're using it is each time we iterate through this list, we're using the value of data set, which will be one of these. And we're using that to define our Fickle. And then I've used this define this out name in the config. So then I can use that for naming the file and having that string in the config environment so we can use it for different places. For example, each iteration here will get its own output. Okay, great. So every time you submit, you will increment the list split. So we do that now. So the split was set to 1 because I'd sent a first probe job. I'm only doing one file. Just again, this is just an example. And doing 10 events. So these should be very fast jobs. Okay, now it's submitted. Now if we go back, sometimes you have to reload the page. Now we see the split is 2. And this is the index, not the value. So you have to figure, okay, 2, what's the value of 2? That was this is the last one used, not what the next one is going to be. If that makes sense. It's the last one submitted. So I could keep doing that until I run out of iterations, or I could reset to go back to the beginning. Now imagine you had 100 of these, and you don't want to sit there and submit 100 times. Or in the case of prod for a 1 GeV Monte Carlo, you have 500, literally 500 submissions that had to be done. POMS has this really nice feature. If you go over here and look for schedule future job launches, you can set up cron style submissions. So if you're iterating over this list, I can say something like, all right, every 5 minutes, I want to do a submission. Okay, you get the idea here. Every hour, every day. So every 5 minutes from in the top half of the hour, this would submit jobs. Or I guess I can just put them all. And again, this is like, if you're familiar with the cron tab in Linux, this is basically the same idea. So this thing will just submit. Every time it submits, it will bump up in the list once until you run out of submissions. So that way you don't have to sit there and hit the button all the time. But that's a very nice feature if you're doing bigger campaigns. Only thing is when you're done, you have no more submissions, which you can tell by when the last split equals the length of your list. Then you should go back here and delete your cron tabs. Otherwise, you're putting extra stress on POMS because it will keep trying to launch and it'll throw an error and say, oh, there's nothing left to do. So it's just wasting cycles, right? Any questions there? If not, I think I'm about out of time.
I just got a question. Just, your general user is generally not going to be doing this right away, right?
Probably not.
Yeah, this is like start out easy. This is you don't have to do all of this all at once.
Well, yeah, and look, if you're running something big enough that requires 100 submissions, you should probably be asking production to do it for you anyway.
Right. In fact, you're welcome to volunteer your services and help the production team. They're always willing to take more help.
And also there are people who, and ask your physics group, because there may be somebody in your physics group that's already doing this. So in particular, I hate to throw Jake under the bus, but Jake Calcutt has figured out how to make tuples out of the large data sets from ProtoDune.
Yeah, that's one thing going forward. We really want to get rid of the duplication of effort where, okay, here's this Rico sample. Everybody goes out and makes their own analysis tuples running over the Rico all the time when we could just have one person do it once. And then everybody uses the same analysis tuples. And just make sure we have everything crammed in there that people need. Because usually when non-production people do analysis tuple making, they might tell a few other people, but the whole experiment doesn't know. And then you end up with, again, several versions of what is 99% the same thing. But that aside, my last example for today is a draining data set. So this you might end up doing for a couple of reasons. If you were ever running over a data set that was changing in time, so for example, might be keep processing of raw data, or imagine you had a large data set and you couldn't submit it all at once. So imagine you have a 12,000 file data set and you can only submit 10,000 jobs at a time. So maybe you say, well, I'm going to break this up into 1,000 job segments and do 12 submissions, or 2,000 job segments and do 6, whatever the number is. You, of course, can do that easily with POMS, but then, or you can do it yourself, but you have to be careful, right, to not submit files that have already been submitted from previous rounds. So POMS keeps track of that for you. You can do a draining data set or a draining N data set type. I usually do the draining N. So if we click on this link, here's the draining data set example. So basically, this is just going back to our POMS demo SAM config from yesterday. Very straightforward. No special fickles. And what we do here, I have n files per job set to 3, but that's again just as an example. But notice here, we define our main data set. This is the overarching one we want to run. And we change the split type to be draining n, and then the number is set here. So if I edit, pretend I wanted to edit this. Excuse me. I was thinking about it. Maybe. A little slow this morning. So basically what would happen is when you submit, it will say, all right, carve me out n files, in this case, n is 2, from the main data set, from the list of files that have not been submitted in previous submissions. So this, you change the split type up here. As you see, you have there's different ones. So with the draining n and n files, that's the, how many files, not how many jobs, how many files you want to deal with every time. So in this case, what will happen is I'll spit out 2 files. I have n files per job is 3, so it will launch 1 job. But again, this is just for example purposes. So if I submit this, here it goes. Now let's look at what actually got run. The commands, the overrides that got passed to launch, our usual config, but look carefully here at the submit.data set, right? It's not my main data set. It's a slightly different one, right? So I told it run Herner May 2022 tutorial MC, and then it automatically made for me slice 0 stage 2. So basically starting from file 0 and then however many files you're going to add to that. So that's all done for me. I don't have to keep track of which files have already been submitted and which ones have not. Now, once that's finished, right now, if I look at the last split, basically this is, I think, a snapshot ID. So that's not an actual value, obviously, in this list. But if you ever needed to go back and say, forget what I did before, just start fresh from the whole data set, then you would hit the reset. But let me launch again, and then you'll see how the input data set changes. Right, so now I'm running this guy. Right, so now instead of slice 0, it's slice whatever that, say, previous snapshot ID was. Make sense? And then you can do this over and over until you run out of files in the original data set. So that's the end of that. Any other questions? Var detector and tuples. We say, right, so that's kind of what we're getting at about, well, we produce stuff and then no one knows anything about them. We do have var detector vertical drift Monte Carlo, and tuples and ANA trees are available and have been for quite a while.
One thing is we probably need to get a coordinated way for physics groups to record what they've done, because ProtoDune has a page that tells you what they've done, but it seems to be internal to each physics group. In general, it's very important that people not just talk to us, but also talk to their physics groups. We find orphans all the time, people that have been told by their advisor to go off and do X, and they go off and do X, and we ask them, and apparently they've never been introduced to their physics group.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
word of
yeah,
wisdom is actually for graduate students in particular, is your physics group is probably going to help you more than your advisor. I speak as an advisor.
right. And we see people, 5 or 6 people all making the same set of files and storing it in Gcache and using up huge amounts of space where you could get together and do it once. And we're trying to encourage that more too.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about earlier. We do have, there's the DUNE data website. Productions maintained it in the past. I really don't have time these days to maintain it. So
Okay.
if someone wants to do some service work maintaining that, that would be appreciated. Because that was intended to be kind of the global, one-stop shop, find everything you want, which back, 4 years ago was much easier to maintain because there wasn't as much stuff. But again, my time is unfortunately limited as far as that goes.
That argues for automation eventually, but
Yeah.
neither do I have time to maintain it.
Well,
So
exactly. Yeah, somebody has to make the automation first, right? Well, who's
yes,
gonna do that?
volunteers are welcome.
Yeah,
Definitely.
So anyways, that is the end of my spiel. Let me stop sharing. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. And I see
Okay, so let's
a
go
couple
back
of
to our,
examples where my test jobs failed overnight, which kind of irritates me. So I will look at those now, and there might be some behind the scenes updates to these config files. If so, I will post to the training group Slack if there's any fixes that need to go in. I will make them and then announce and say, hey, if you want to try this again, pull a new config. The configs will be at the same place, but I may tweak